Public baths, a party, a bounty, and a ring of heads. All in this episode of What the F Does This Even Mean? Blood Meridian. Welcome to What the F Does This Even Mean? Blood Meridian. I'm your host, Amy from Amy Gets Lit. This is episode 5 of my series on Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. This video will be discussing chapters 13, 14, and 15. In this video, I will be summarizing the next part of our journey with the kid, the judge, and rest of Glanton's gang, and pointing out parts of these chapters I find particularly significant or interesting. In my last video, the kid and Tobin had a chat around the fire. We learned how the judge came into Glanton's gang, that urine plus bat guano and brimstone make gunpowder, and more about the judge and his many talents. And we followed Glanton's gang as they continued their journey back to Chihuahua City to cash in the scalps they had collected along the way. In Chihuahua City, 128 scalps and 8 heads were counted among the stones, and the men were told that they would be paid that evening at a dinner being held in their honor at a hotel. They went to the public bathhouses to get cleaned up first. From the book. They moved on to the public baths where they descended one by one into the waters, each more pale than the other before and all tattooed, branded, sutured. The great puck scars inaugurated God knows where by what barbarous surgeons across the chest and abdomens, like the tracks of giant millipedes, some deformed, fingers missing, eyes, their foreheads and arms stamped with letters and numbers as if they were articles requiring inventory. Citizens of both sexes withdrew along the walls and watched the water turn into a thin gruel of blood and filth, and none could take their eyes from the judge who had disrobed last of all and now walked the perimeter of the baths with a cigar in his mouth and a regal air, testing waters with one toe, surprisingly petite. He shone like the moon, so pale he was, and not a hair to be seen anywhere upon that vast corpus, not in any crevice, nor in the great bores of his nose, and not upon his chest, nor in his ears, nor any tufts at all above his eyes, nor to the lids thereof. The immense and gleaming dome of his naked skull looked like a cap for bathing pulled down to the otherwise darkened skin of his face and neck. As the great bulk lowered itself into the bath and the waters rose perceptibly, and when he had submerged himself to the eyes, he looked about with considerable pleasure, the eyes slightly crinkled, as if he were smiling under the water like some pale and bloated manatee surfaced in a bog, while behind his small and close-set ear the wedged cigar smoked gently just above the waterline. Okay, so a few things to start off here. The Mexicans counted and hung the scalps and put the heads on stakes, not realizing that among those counted were Mexicans, their very own people, the people that Glanton's gang are meant to protect with this contract against the Apaches. When Glanton's gang enters the public baths, the evidence of their violence creates a mixture of blood and filth into a gruel in the very water that's meant to clean them. To me, this means that they are sitting in a soup of their actions and their violence, and they can never really get clean. Notice, though, the judge and the way he's described. He shone like a moon so pale, the immense and gleaming dome of his naked skull, a pale and bloated manatee, his only darkened skin his face and neck, which would have happened from being out in the brutal sun. Everyone else is full of filth and blood, and the judge is not, but he still sits in their filth and in their violence, and he smiles. The men show up to their dinner in new clothes, the Delawares wearing European morning coats. This is another example of how great McCarthy's writing is and how he will include one small detail that speaks to a larger thought. We have the Delawares, indigenous people hunting other indigenous people for money, now dressing like the white men they ride with. I think it's a pretty powerful point. Submit to the white man or be hunted and killed. The judge arrived last of all, dressed in a well-cut suit of unbleached linen that had been made for him that very afternoon. Whole bolts of cloth exhausted and squads of tailors as well in that fabrication. His feet were encased in a nicely polished gray kid boot, and in his hand he held a Panama hat that had been spliced together from 2 such lesser hats by such painstaking work that the joinery did scarcely show at all. The governor invited the judge to sit next to him, and they spoke in a foreign language no one else in the room understood. Tobin raised his eyebrows at the kid and motioned his head towards the judge, reminding the kid about their conversation around the fire. The kid sat stiffly and uncomfortably, wearing the first starch collar shirt he had ever owned. The men were fed food, and the Mexicans raised their glasses, toasting American heroes like Washington and Franklin. The Americans raised their glasses and toasted more American heroes, ignorant both of diplomacy and of Mexican history. The cook brings out food, and the gang eats it all up and demands more. Their demands are met until the cook has to barricade the door and have the soldiers dump the food on the table. As they eat and drink, they grow more ill-behaved and obscene. The money is dumped on the table amongst the bones and pools of spilled drink, and it gets dispersed among the men. They take their party out into the streets. Each night is a repeat of the night before. Pure debauchery by Glanton's men. In the evening, the citizens would stay home, and the young girls were locked up inside to keep everyone safe from them. They leave the city on August 15th. When they arrived, they were met with much fanfare. When they leave, no one gives a damn, and no one sees them off. The village of Coyame had for some years been laid under annual contribution by Gomez and his band. When Glanton and his men rode in, they were fallen upon as saints. Women ran alongside the horses to touch their boots, and presents of every kind were pressed upon them, until each man rode with an embarrassment of melons and pastry and trussed chickens gathered in the bow of his saddle. When they rode out 3 days later, the streets stood empty. Not even a dog followed them to the gates. Glanton's gang are beginning to wear out their welcome with the Mexicans wherever they go. They come to their villages, essentially pillage, and then leave. Here we have people who are at the mercy of Gomez, and now they just want the people that are supposed to save them from Gomez gone, because they see them for who they are after spending time in their village. They travel towards the borderlands of Texas seeking Apaches. We learn that Glanton has a warrant out for his arrest in Texas, and that he has a wife and child 400 miles away. What is interesting here is that despite the unhappiness their behavior is now causing, he was looked upon as a hero among the Mexican people when he first arrives in their towns. But in his own country, he's a villain, a wanted man. They ride south again and come across the peaceful Chihuahua people, and they kill each and every one of them. Toadvine and the kid conferred together, and when they rode out at noon the day following, they trotted their horses alongside Bath Cat. They rode in silence. "Them sons of bitches ain't bothering nobody," Toadvine said. The Vandermanlander looked at him. He looked at the livid letters tattooed on his forehead and at the lank, greasy hair that hung from his earless skull. He looked at the necklace of gold teeth at his chest. They rode on. Toadvine is upset that they were ordered to and killed the Tigwas people. In our last video, he was angry about what Holden did to the child too, but he also has a necklace of gold teeth around his chest. These actions suggest that Toadvine takes issue when people he views as innocent are killed, but he has no issue killing those he deems deserving or in which he profits. Contrast this outrage over the deaths of innocents with his appearance. The fact he is marked because he's been imprisoned. He has no ears, the wounds he's taken while killing others. It's a very interesting point he makes here. In the days to come, the frail black rebuses of blood in those sands would crack and break and drift away, so that in the circuit of a few suns, all trace of the destruction of these people would be erased. The desert wind would salt their ruins, and there would be nothing, nor ghost nor scribe, to tell of any pilgrim in his passing how it was that people had lived in this place, and in this place died. The narrator of our story is telling us that the people will be forgotten. This violence against them will be forgotten. It will disappear and be part of an untold history. But our narrator is telling us this story. Our narrator is witness to this. In our narrator telling the story, he's making sure that these people are not forgotten. This is textual evidence to what I think that the epilogue means, so please remember this. They ride back to Chihuahua City, and two soldiers step to Toadvine asking about teeth. Do y'all remember who had gold teeth? The prison guard from chapter 6. Goldvine made good on his promise that he was going to murder him, and he kept his teeth as a souvenir. They leave 2 days later under the escort of over 100 soldiers riding them out of town. They come upon the village of Nakari and find a katina there. They get into a fight there and kill and scalp everyone before riding off again. They go to another village where they kill people in the church and scalp them. We saw this scene before, back in chapter 5, when Sproul and the kid came across the village after the filibuster was ambushed. In this book, history repeats itself and the cycle of violence continues on. By this time, their behavior has become known and Mexican soldiers are after them. They get into a shootout with them, killing many of the Mexican soldiers, but others escape. Glanton orders his people to go after them so there are no witnesses to their crimes. They decide they better try to outride the Mexican soldiers back to Chihuahua City. It's all about that green, y'all. After 20 miles away from the city, they come across the remaining Mexican soldiers. They kill them, burying their bodies and all of their effects to erase any evidence. Glanton is already wanted in the U.S. In Mexico, he has freedom. He is afraid of losing that freedom. They reach Chihuahua, turning in the scalps of Mexican citizens and saying that they belong to Apaches. They are paid, but told that the city is running out of money and their contract ends. Within 1 week, a price tag of 8,000 pesos is now placed on Glanton's head. The gang rides through rain and hail and rain again. They ride through a highland meadow carpeted with wildflowers. It rains again, they wander. Without the Apaches to hunt, they're aimless. They finally come across an inn and stay there. By noon the next day, they are drunk again. The judge had spied the musician and he called to him and tossed a coin that clinked upon the stones. The fiddler held it briefly to the light as if it might not serve, and then slipped it away among his clothes and fitted his instrument beneath his chin and struck up an air that was old among the mountebanks of Spain 200 years before. The judge stepped into the sunlit doorway and executed upon the stones a series of steps with a strange precision, and he and the fiddler seemed alien minstrels met by chance in this medieval town. Their debauchery continues into the night. Isn't it interesting that whenever the judge dances, it brings out the worst of their behavior? Just pointing it out. And into the next night. They are going on a bender. A group of Americans going to California come. They're totally exhausted, but they leave instead of resting because Glanton's gang is so disruptive and rowdy, they make them uneasy. Glanton is so out of control that he is tied to a bed and Judge Holden takes care of him. It is discovered that a little girl is missing in the village. Go out looking for her. This is another situation where something happens to a child and the judge is around. I'm just saying. While the judge is off doing judge things, Glanton wakes up and frees himself from his bindings. He cuts down a Mexican flag and ties it to the tail of a donkey and rides it around, the flag dragging on the ground and getting muddy. It's like if Glanton doesn't have trouble, he creates it. The villagers shoot the donkey and a gunfight breaks out, killing 6 of Glanton's men before the rest escape. 2 other men catch up with the gang and tell them that those left behind in the village were baptized and then killed. The gang come across a muleteer and his men leading a large herd of donkeys to a mine. Glanton causes trouble again, nearly forcing the muleteer off the mountain path. The muleteer reaches for his rifle and is shot by David Brown. Another gunfight happens with the muleteer's men and they are all killed, with donkeys falling off the cliff. They continue their travels in camp. Tovine sat watching him as he made his notations in the ledger, holding the book toward the fire for the light, and he asked him what was his purpose in all this. The judge's quill ceased its scratching. He looked at Toadvine. Then he continued to write again. Toadvine spat into the fire. The judge wrote on, and then he folded the ledger shut and laid it to one side and pressed his hands together and passed them down over his nose and mouth and placed them palm down on his knees. Whatever exists, he said, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. That last quote is one of my favorite quotes of this book. Whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. That is such a powerful quote. Knowing what we know about the judge and the conclusions we can draw about him, this quote adds another layer of power to him, of mystery. Supernatural or not, I don't know, but what a freaking awesome quote. The judge then goes on to tell Toadvine that only nature can enslave man, and that in order to be a suzerain or a type of overlord, he needs to know and understand everything. Toadvine sat with his boots crossed before the fire. No man can acquaint himself with everything on this earth, he said. The judge tilted his great head. The man who believes that the secrets of the world are forever hidden lives in mystery and fear. Superstition will drag him down. The rain will erode the deeds of his life. But that man sets himself the task of singling out the thread of order from the tapestry will by that decision alone have taken charge of the world, and it is only by such taking charge that he will effect a way to dictate the terms of his own fate. I don't see what that has to do with catching birds. The freedom of birds is an insult to me. I'd have them all in zoos. That would be a hell of a zoo. The judge smiled. Yes, he said, even so. I've never related to the judge's character more than this exchange because I'm someone who wants to know everything so that I can't be taken unprepared. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I do love this whole exchange with Toadvine. To this point, most of the judge's interactions have been told through witnesses, and his conversations are with those men with some sort of power. Glanton, the fortune-reading juggler, the governor of the city, and the conversations, not the judge's lectures, but the conversations, have been about his ledger with the other men. In the last part of this exchange, when the judge talks about men living in mystery and fear and superstition dragging them down, the judge is saying that he is going to be the man who determines his own fate. And part of determining his whole fate is to understand the world around him and in his decision-making use that information. I think that's really powerful, and it speaks a lot to the idea of knowledge being power and willful ignorance, misinformation. A lot of these things that we're seeing now that are a real problem with people not being able to determine fact from fiction and capitalizing on that for profit. On December 2nd, 1849, they ride into the capital of the state of Sonora. They stay in a hostel owned by a German, but the man disappears and the townspeople take care of them. I believe that the townspeople have heard about them and only take care of them to avoid violence. Glanton is still mad, shooting dogs in the courtyard. The judge has a boy and his friend get horses for Glanton and the judge, and the chapter ends. On the 5th of December, they rode out north in the cold darkness before daybreak, carrying with them a contract signed by the governor of the state of Sonora for the furnishing of Apache scalps. The streets were silent and empty. They ride for quite some time, chasing rumors of where the Apaches are. They kill those that they come upon and head back to Uris to claim the money for their scalps. On their way back to Uris, they get into a gunfight with the Sonoran military of 500 men led by General Elias. It seems that the Sonoran government had already heard of these murderous Americans and gave them a contract only to get them out of their town before setting their own military after them. In other words, setting them up. 3 of Glanton's gang have been killed and 7 have been wounded. 4 of those wounded are wounded so badly that they can't carry on. Glanton has his men draw arrows to see who will be responsible for killing these 4 men. It's the kid's turn to pick his arrow. When the kid selected among the shafts to draw one, he saw the judge watching him and he paused. He looked at Glanton. He let go the arrow he'd chosen and sorted out another and drew that one. It carried the red tassel. He looked at the judge again and the judge was not watching, and he moved on and took his place with Tate and Webster. They were joined finally by a man named Harlan from Texas who had drawn the last arrow, and the 4 of them stood together while the rest saddled their horses and led them out. The kid wanted to avoid picking one of these arrows. It is the judge watching him that he changes his mind and he ends up choosing another arrow. And this one does have the tassel. It's almost as if it's the judge's will that the kid is one of the 4 chosen to kill the wounded men. 2 Delawares, a Mexican, and a man named Dick Shelby are the 4 critically wounded. The Delawares still riding within the company discussed things amongst themselves and took the arrows from Webster and Harlan. They did not want these white men killing their wounded Delaware brothers, and they killed the wounded 2 themselves. This leaves Tate and the kid to take care of the other 2 wounded. Tate squatted in the sand, his hands dangling in front of him. He turned and looked at the kid. "Who gets the Mexican?" he said. The kid didn't answer. They looked at Shelby. He was watching them. Tate had a clutch of small pebbles in his hand and he let them drop one by one into the sand. He looked at the kid. "Go on if you want to," the kid said. He looked at the Delawares dead in their blankets. "You might not do it," he said. "That ain't your worry. Glanton might come back." "He might." Tate looked over to where the Mexican was lying and he looked at the kid again. "I'm still held to it," he said. The kid didn't answer. "You know what they'll do to them?" The kid spat. "I can guess," he said. "No, you can't." "I said you could go. You do what you want." Tate leaves. The Mexican was shot in the lungs and his death would happen soon from his injuries anyway, so the kid decides not to shoot him. Shelby, on the other hand, had his hip shattered and is conscious of everything going on around him. He tells the kid to shoot him, but the kid is hesitant. He tells the kid that Glanton will kill him for not shooting him. The kid offers to hide Shelby instead. As he carries him to a bush, Shelby attempts to take the kid's gun but fails. The kid gets ready to get out of Dodge and catch up with the rest of the company when Shelby calls out for water. Despite the fact that Shelby just attempted to take his gun, he goes back to him, leaving Shelby with a canteen. Here we see the kid's selfishness and selflessness. Selfishly, he does not want to murder Shelby. He doesn't want to kill him, even if he is injured. He doesn't want that on his conscience. And so he leaves Shelby. And he's leaving Shelby to a much worse fate for those who come upon him. He's going to be tortured. He's going to have a painful death. But the kid doesn't care. The kid only cares that he doesn't have to deal with the implications of killing him. The selflessness part is, even after Shelby tried to grab his gun and hurt the kid, tell the kid that he would shoot him, he leaves him water. He goes back and leaves his canteen. I think that's an interesting texture of the kid's character here. The kid rides to catch up with the gang and comes across Tate. Tate's horse has gone lame. He tells the kid to go ahead, but the kid dismounts and walks with him. It begins to snow. They take turns riding the good horse while the other one leads the lame one. Once they reach the ridge, the snow is already a foot deep. They camp for the night and are approached by 5 scouts from General Elias's group. The kid shoots one and takes off running, leaving Tate behind. This is another situation where we see the kid's selflessness and selfishness. Selflessly, he gets off and he goes with Tate. He doesn't leave him behind yet, but once danger's there, he does. The kid walks all day. He walks all night just to stay warm and sleeps only briefly at dawn. He sees 2 groups clashing in the distance. He continues his walk. He comes across a lone tree on fire in the desert. Many desert creatures were crouched around it. He warmed there and sleeps. He wakes and travels forth. He comes upon a scorched earth where Glanton's gang had burned the scalps they had collected. Another situation where they get rid of evidence of their violence. He came upon a horse, and after some struggle, he was able to ride it. Another horse finds him and stays by his side, like they're spooked. He looks ahead and sees a group of men. He rejoins the gang. They looked bad. They were used up and bloody and black about the eyes, and they had bound up their wounds with linens that were filthy and blood-stained, and their clothes were crusted with dried blood and powder black. Glanton's eyes in their dark sockets were burning centroids of murder, and he and his haggard riders stared balefully at the kid as if he were no part of them, for all they were so like in wretchedness of circumstance. The kid slid down from the horse and stood among them, gaunt and parched and crazed looking. Someone threw him a canteen. Here's another example of the kid being different than the others. This time, though, it is their shared experience that the kid was not there for that sets him apart. The kid finds out that 4 more men have died and others have gone ahead to scout. They now have enemies surrounding them. The Apaches are ahead of them, and General Elias and his men are behind them. It seems that our gang is going to face consequences for their actions, both against the Apaches and the Mexicans. They ride on the next day and make camp. The judge chooses the weakest among their horses to kill and eat. He led it past the fire and called for someone to come hold it. No one rose. The ex-priest leaned to the kid. "Pay him no mind, lad." The judge called again from the dark beyond the fire, and the ex-priest placed a cautionary hand upon the kid's arm. But the kid rose and spat into the fire. He turned and eyed the ex-priest. "You think I'm afraid of him?" The ex-priest didn't answer, and the kid turned and went out into the darkness where the judge waited. Tobin, the ex-priest, has tried to warn the kid about the judge several times now. This is the second time that Tobin has tried to keep the kid from volunteering where no one else does. Tobin clearly sees something inside the kid. Is it goodness? Is it kindness? Is it naivety? Does he just want to take care of him and sort of parent him? Just as the case with removing the arrow, the kid ignores Tobin's advice and goes into the dark with the judge, something every other man would not do. Perhaps the other men have been around the judge enough to be afraid. I don't know. This is one of the few interactions that the judge and the kid have together. We know that the kid has been watching the judge, and we know that the judge has been watching the kid. I think that's an interesting disconnect there. They ride on and come across a grotesque display of 8 heads placed in a ring, looking outward. The judge kicks one of the heads to make sure that men are not buried underneath them. This shows us that violence is common here. It isn't just the roving gangs like Glanton chasing after Apaches and people chasing after them. We touch on this with a couple of examples in our last video too, with the carriages. where they find the dead men inside the carriage and they come across the camp with the mutilated men and the burning wagons. They ride on and end up in Santa Cruz, where they are met with open contempt. One family takes pity on them and allows them to sleep in their stable. And this ends chapter 15. There are now only 2 more videos left about the book and 1 video looking at the plot, characters, and themes to tie everything up for this series. In the next video, I'll be discussing chapters 16, 17, 18, and 19. Things are about to get really interesting, y'all. I'm excited. That means so excited in Amy speak. If you enjoyed this content, please let me know by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, ringing the bell, and leaving a comment below. I would really, really appreciate it. I'm very, very excited to come to a conclusion to this. I hope that you've enjoyed reading along. I will see you next week.